Either you believe it is worth better connecting the regions and the big provincial cities in England to each other and to London, or you don't. You either see there is a need to rebalance the economy, strengthen the economy of the Midlands and the North. And while we're at it, why not remember there's a place called Scotland and North Wales and so on. Either you believe that's worth investing in or you don't.
Welcome to Calling All Stations, the transport podcast. I'm Christian Walmart, an author and journalist who has covered transport for the past 30 years. In every episode, we try to keep you up to date with the most engaging news stories, policy developments, and interviews in the transport world. And with me is my regular co-presenter, Mark Walker, who has spent decades looking at transport policies and legislation. So, Mark, what have we got today?
Hello, Christian, and hello to our listeners. We have a special episode today with just one item, an interview with Jim Steer, the director of Greengauge 21. Jim is acknowledged as a real expert on all matters to do with high-speed rail, but in particular on the HS2 project, which of course has featured highly in the news in recent months and in several episodes of this podcast. Jim's going to give us his perspective on all of this in a level of detail which I think he hasn't done previously since the announcement of the cancellation of the sections of HS2 north of Birmingham. So here's your interview.
Given the problems with HS2 and where to go now, and given that we're likely to have a Labour government sometime this year, the new ministers are going to be faced with the problem of what to do with this kind of, half-baked scheme, which is what it's ended up being. So I thought there was no better person to go to than Jim Steer, the director of Greengauge 21, who has long kind of sponsored and promoted the idea of HS2, to try to take us through the options for the Labour Party. So, Jim, just to start with, you must have been pretty shocked by both the fact that this was cut back in this way between Birmingham and Crewe, but also the manner in which it happened.
Well, it was a shock. I don't think anybody really saw this coming, including even the Department for Transport and the Secretary of State for Transport. So why should I be surprised? Not be surprised?
Is that right? You think it was bounced even on him, was it?
Well, the Secretary of State for Transport, of course, signed off on the decision and Network North and so on. But I think it's known that the department was brought in fairly late. I think the permanent secretary has said, well, they didn't know about it until the end of August, for a decision being made at the beginning of October. That basically gives you a month to sort out what you're really going to do, including dreaming up, well, this idea of, here's £36 billion that we were going to spend on HS2. Let's spend it on what I've chosen to call a smorgasbord of other transport projects. But it's important to remember this fundamental thing. The government wasn't, the Prime Minister, government wasn't saying, we're going to save the money we would have spent on HS2. It's saying we're going to spend it on other parts of transport, mainly on the road network. So I think it was a bad news day for the rail sector, of which HS2, in forward planning terms, have become an inseparable part. Yeah, right. I was shocked.
Yes, okay. And indeed, it's quite remarkable that also that this is a capital expenditure, and then they're going to spend it on operating expenditure to fill potholes. So they're not only transferring from rail, they're transferring it to road, but also transferring it from long-term capital expenditure to patching up the roads. The whole thing, I think is just completely incoherent. But okay, so we are where we are. You are the Secretary of State for Transport. You've just got the job in the autumn of 2024. You've got some decisions to make about HS2. What would you try to do?
I think it's actually very clear, and it's not hard. I mean, there are a whole bunch of reviews underway that, you know, the Secretary of State's going to gather up and say, oh, look at this, look at that. But basically what Labour needs to do is to say, right, well, this may have been shot badly, but it hasn't capsized. We can build, and we should build, and we should aim to do it by 2030 or very soon thereafter, a complete railway from Euston to Crewe. There's powers to do all of that. This includes so-called Phase 2A from Handsacre to Crewe. Build that, because if you build that, you can create a coherent step forward for the national rail network. Okay, there's then lots of options after that, but the key message I would have as Secretary of State, thank you for giving me the role. I would say
you might be sacked by the end of this conversation.
Yeah, well, and it may not be a Labour government, of course, but yes. This will bring about transformational benefit to rail travel in Britain. It's a step worth taking. Unfortunately, the last government made the mistake of chopping off really probably the most critical section of route. Don't worry, the land hasn't been sold. We have all the powers. The bit that was chopped off that I'm saying should be added back in has a budget of around £6 to £7 billion. So think of it as spending £1 billion a year over the next 6 or 7 years, which is what it'll take. In transport budget terms, it's not huge. You will create a coherent whole. You then say, well, what about the rest of it? Phase 2B, Crewe, Manchester, and so on, where the business case is a lot worse. I mean, Phase 2A, Handsacre to Crewe, is a very strong business case. It's around 2 to 1. It's not expensive. All the alternatives to it have been looked at and dismissed. Even arch opponents of Phase 2A, like Jack Brereton, local MP, has said, well, we'll need to widen that section of route. You can't widen that section of route without causing huge local adverse impacts. So we get on and do it, get it to Crewe, and then, okay, the next big question, well, what about the rest of it? Phase 2B and so on. Let me pause there, because the rest of it is much more complicated. That first bit is pretty straightforward. Get on and do it. And put right this completely irrational.
Well, I mean, first of all, there is one objection and then one point. The objection is, look, we're now up to 67 billion for the first bit, which is Old Oak Common to Birmingham. You know, there's no guarantee that will even get within that. I mean, if you're a new Labour government with lots of kind of competing expenditure possibilities, would you really prioritise adding more billions to that to create this railway?
Well, if you don't, you're causing yourself a big problem. First of all, you're adding to it the big constraint on the West Coast Main Line, which is between the West Midlands and Crewe. If you want to look at it in just cash terms for Treasury, think about this. What happened to the Channel Tunnel rail link? It was built, it was completed, service had got up and running, and then, admittedly, a Conservative government said, is there anything on the stocks we can kind of sell off, help Treasury out? It let a long-term concession. It was worth a few £1 billion, and this is relative to HS2, quite a short railway with not a lot of value apart from getting people from London to Paris. Not that many, it's not that intensively used. We don't know what government plans, whether Conservative or Labour, will be once HS2 is complete, up and running, provable. At that point, all the risk transfer issues around privatising a bit of infrastructure disappear. We don't know if it will be done. But I tell you this, if you don't build Phase 2A, the value of Phase 1, which is where the big money is, Euston to Birmingham, Handsacre, will be a lot less.
Well, that was my point. That was my second point. Yes. Well, how do you leave? How do you cope with just having that?
Yeah,
or you don't. You just think it's not feasible.
Well, and also, if you want to extract some value of it, which quite possible, I mean, government's never committed to doing this, but it's quite possible, of course. You can see as an investor, if you're a Canadian teachers' pension fund or maybe even a British pension fund, oh, look, I will get income out of track fees if I buy this on a long-term concession. You could do the same thing. You can't do it without phase 2A because the whole thing is damaged. So that 6 to 7 billion is probably will pay for itself even in cash terms to Treasury.
You could privatize it, basically.
Well, you could. I'm not advocating doing that. I'm saying you could. You're challenging me saying, why spend some more money on it? I'm saying, well, if you don't, you've ruled out that option or you've diminished massively the value you get from it.
Okay, so then there's the other bit you're talking about, the Euston to Old Oak Common bit. You're also saying that ought to be built. The government has said this could be built by the private sector. I've always been deeply suspicious of that. I presume you are too. So how are you going to cope with that bit? And that is a really very expensive bit.
It's long planned. It's in the huge sum that you quote in your words for building phase 1.
Some of it, there's about 4 billion of it in that 67 billion, apparently. And it might well cost more than 4 billion.
It is essential, obviously, to make HS2 work. There's been, talk of huge private sector contributions out of the development for Euston. They are, I'm afraid, fanciful. And I speak from experience in my consultancy back in the day of funding major transport projects in London with private sector funding. And you'll know those well.
Yes.
It's completely impossible to get the scale of funding out of property development at Euston, and quite inappropriate. So you have to face up to it. This is a piece of national infrastructure. We have been funding this through public sector, government funding. Yes, it's got more expensive, but so too, I have to say, is just about every infrastructure project you could pick to do instead. Either you believe it is worth better connecting the regions and the big provincial cities in England, both better to each other and to London, or you don't. You either see there is a need to rebalance the economy, strengthen the economy of the Midlands and the North, and while we're at it, why not remember there's a place called Scotland and North Wales and so on. Either you believe that's worth investing in, or you don't.
So that would be your big message to Keir Starmer, which is holding it, because he's already intimated that he might not reinstate the Birmingham to the Handsacre to Crewe bit, and you think that would be a fundamental mistake. And just as a last point, I mean, what would happen if we do just get left with what I've called the Acton to Aston shuttle? Do you think that really will be a completely useless kind of railway?
I'm not even prepared to think about it.
Oh, really? Why?
But I think
it's so awful.
If you look at, well, it's completely ridiculous, isn't it? You might as well talk about the Romney Hythe Dymchurch for its relevance to the national economy.
That's a great quote, Jim.
Yeah, what I think Sir Keir Starmer actually said was, I can't commit to funding to get HS2 to Manchester. That's what he said. And that's part of the phase 2B story, as much as phase 2A helps you get to Crewe, but then you've got this more expensive and more problematic link, really, in that there's not really a very good business case for it. And part of the reason for that was, and you have to cast your memory back here to the end of the Oakervie review and government's reaction to it, where the bit north of Crewe actually got its left-hand branch pruned off it.
Right.
The bit was in the view of, we said this at the time, Greengauge view, as well, really, if you're up against it and think you can't afford it, I'm afraid you have to trim off the branch to Manchester, because you can still get trains there. It's very constrained. You can't run long trains into the existing station, blah-de-blah. But HS2 is a scheme that works over long distances. We seem to have forgotten Scotland. We've forgotten the rest of Lancashire and Cumbria. So the key link north of Crewe is actually to Wigan. I mean, we want the link to Manchester as well, but that's already been chopped off. Now, going back to that, and this is an expensive bit of schemes, tunnels into Manchester, long tunnel, new stations, They're expensive, unlike Handsacre to Crewe, which is pretty straightforward. Question, what should the Labour government, do about this? We're now in government, aren't we? There we go. What am I going to do about this? I'm afraid I'm going to have to think very hard about how best to take this forward. That means it may not happen in the way that was planned. I am not going to commit to funding that. What am I going to commit to?
You're not going to commit to funding the Manchester bit, basically.
Crewe Manchester.
Yeah.
Don't forget the Department for Transport, basically, I think, trying to work up the case for this, had been told to take it forward, said, this can form part of Northern Powerhouse Rail. Oh, well, that's a completely different thing. And of course, the Labour Party in opposition, and probably the Labour government, will say, no, we're very committed to make these improvements in the north, because you're rather doomed on the red wall seats if you don't say that. It's rather tiresome, but politicians will say they're committed to these things, but actually none of the proper planning has been done on this. And let me explain what I mean by that. There's been a bit of a fixation, and it's run for around 10 years, on the links between the big cities in the north. We need them to be faster, more frequent, and so on. Well, that's part of what the north needs, clearly, and it was in the Northern Powerhouse vision that was articulated back in 2014. So, okay, what's really needed to improve those links? Now, as a railway person, you might think, maybe it's electrified. Yes, need to be electrified. Could they be speeded up? Well, hang on, there's a mix of services. It'd be good to. The problems are in the big cities, in the centre of the big cities, in particular Manchester and also Leeds, but especially Manchester. Unless you tackle the problems in a comprehensive way, thinking about all of the needs, freight, local transport, what you're going to do with Metrolink, expand it, intercity, Transpennine. Unless you think of all those in a combined sense, it won't work. We've got a half-built so-called Northern Hub in Manchester. As HS2 services come in, there's going to be more people who are going to want to access Piccadilly by train from around the northern side of Manchester, as well as from the city centre. Where's the solution? So that's where the priority really has to be. And you have to look at these things segment by segment across the north. So where is the coherent plan for the northwest? HS2 needs to fit in with that, but so does a coherent freight strategy. We know, 75% increase in freight, the government's committed to, fantastic, but it was meant to be a doubling of freight. So phase 2A had something to do with that. But, you have to look at those things together. I'm not saying, therefore, you've given me the job, thank you, Secretary of State. I can't yet guarantee that we'll do Crewe Manchester. We might do. We might look at other ways of doing it. We'll certainly look to do it in combination with other things so that you get a coherent whole. Because what people in the north want is a rail service that works. It wants reliability.
Absolutely, Jim. But you've left with a problem here, then. So, okay, we get the Handsacre to Crewe bit built. What do we do with those trains when they get to Crewe? Crewe is not a destination. What happens to them? And do we have these long trains? What happens?
Well, I think that there was always going to be a problem between phase 2A and phase 2B. And phase 2B, let's be realistic, possibly has a timescale of 2040, probably 10 years behind 2A, and it could get longer. What has to happen, first of all, is you're going to have to face up to the fact that you can't run shorter trains than run today between Manchester and London. Right. So HS2 is technical detail, but they're 200-metre long trains. You can pair them up and have a 400-metre long train. Well, you can't get a 400-metre long train into Piccadilly or indeed Liverpool Lime Street. So we're going to have to modify that and probably have a 250-metre train, slightly shorter than a Pendolino, but the capacity will be pretty much the same. So you have to think through the practical. I would suggest thinking in terms of 5-year milestones with this. Where we're going to be at the end of the 2020s, mid 2030s, 2040, 20. There's no realism about these timescales. We desperately need that. Transpennine route upgrade is progressing. Who wouldn't say complete that? I mean, it's not committed yet, the expenditure on electrifying the route all of the way. I mean, that's the plan. I'm not saying government doesn't want to do it, but it's not yet signed off on that. These things are happening. What are we going to do in Liverpool? You can't sort out Manchester without knowing what you're going to do in Liverpool and so on. These things will cost money. Would you choose to spend 15 to 20 billion on phase 2B? I'm not sure you would, once you look at it in that context. And I think a wise Secretary of State for Transport would conclude the same.
Well, thank you, Jim. You surprised me with some of those answers, actually. But I think that's a very measured and interesting response to the problem. Let's see what happens if and when we do get this Labour government, and whether they make any sensible decisions around it. So thank you for coming on the programme.
Not at all, Christian. Good to see you.
Well, Mark, what I found really interesting about that is Jim was so scathing about the idea of leaving this as what I've dubbed the Acton to Aston shuttle, saying it was no more use than the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway. And that's pretty amazing from somebody who, was really behind the whole idea of HS2 and was promoted it for many years, and indeed I think really was one of the people who actually managed to convince politicians to build it. And now he's saying that if they leave it as it is with just this one line, then connecting Old Oak Common with Birmingham Curzon Street, it won't be much use. And that's pretty extraordinary, given that this is going to cost us at the last reckoning £67 billion.
It's like we're going to be left with this huge feature in the landscape that possibly future generations, perhaps even people hundreds of years from now, will look on with in bafflement and amazement, possibly even trying to work out what it was for, like kind of NASCAR lines or something
Adrian's
like that.
Wall.
Well, at least we were clear on the purpose of Adrian's Wall overall. But I think, I mean, I found Jim's interview very insightful that he gave to you, but also he brought out the illogicality of not completing the phase 2A from Birmingham to Crewe, for which the parliamentary powers, the legislation, has already been approved, and the actual cost of that section in relation to the enormous benefit it unlocks is really quite dramatic, and why we can't at least see that section completed is looking increasingly, I think, incongruous in the commentary around this issue.
Yes, I mean, if you were going to cut one bit, actually, that was the bit that seems the best value, the highest benefit to cost ratio, the most useful in terms of the national rail network, providing extra route where it's most needed. So yes, I mean, it's why it has been seen as just a kind of completely random decision. And we know that from the chaotic launch of the decision to cut it in the Tory party conference, where really Rishi Sunak's speech barely made any sense at all, and he was clearly kind of completely out of his depth. And now we're left with this stump of a line. And basically, I think what Jim says poses problems for the Labour Party if it takes power, as we expect and hope, by the end of this year. What is it going to do about it? Because certainly committing extra funds to this line is not going to be a popular decision. But Jim is basically saying you also have to connect it up to Euston, and that the private sector is never going to do that.
And I think you've made the point in one of our previous episodes that there's a lot of logic in Euston to Crewe, and a lot of the costs are already committed. So were a future government of any complexion to decide to complete that section of the route, it would have a kind of intellectual and planning logic that the current shuttle, as you put it, from Acton to Aston doesn't have. I think the politics of this are also becoming increasingly interesting, in that on a recent episode of the BBC Laura Kuenssberg show, which featured a focus group of voters talking about their intentions this year in relation to a possible general election, the cancellation of HS2 actually did register with the group as something that was seen as doing down the north of Britain, and was becoming a factor in voters' choices. So you can see on the one hand the problem that the Conservatives have made for themselves by cancellation, but also the potential missed opportunity for Labour if they don't come up with some kind of package that involves making the most of HS2.
Well, yes. I mean, the problem, of course, is as you know, the cost, and the cost of Euston is at least £4.5 billion just to build the station itself, as well as kind of the connecting tunnels, from Old Oak Common into Euston. That's going to be another, 5 or 6 billion. So say 10 billion for that thing, and then an estimated 5 to 10 billion for the crew sections, and that's another 20 billion. And we're talking serious money at some stage of this to add to the 67 billion that's already been spent. So we're not going to get away very much short of nearly 100 billion for a line that, even if it does make sense, which it does, Euston to Crewe, it's still an extraordinary expense in relation to government expenditure generally. But Keir Starmer is going to be faced with having to make decisions over this with really no easy options.
Calling All Stations, the Transport podcast with Christian Walmart, is produced by Cogitamus Limited, a leading provider of public affairs consultancy services in the sector. We hope you've enjoyed this episode. If you have, please consider giving us a 5-star rating with whichever platform you use. Do also follow us on X, formerly known as Twitter. Our handle is @AllStationsPod.